In those early days, it took a lot more strategic work in order to make those things happen. But over time, the cooperation came. And now people don't freak out as much when we need to paint something, or we need to renovate something, or if we need to tear something out, or we need to do something differently. Our people have gotten used to necessary changes and impact. You need to be able to know the difference between what you own, what you must buy, and how much it is likely to cost. Change is necessary for growth, and I went to West Coast Baptist College, and Pastor Chappell would always tell us that a growing ministry is always in transition. The fact is that our ministries are never really stagnant, that frequently they are either increasing or they're in decline. So as a young pastor, when you come into ministry and you start, the traditional advice has always been, well, don't change anything for the first 2 years, just come on in and preach Jesus, and then you'll be able to change some things after that. But the fact is that when you start in a ministry somewhere, that oftentimes when you arrive as the new pastor, you have a new set of eyes from the outside that you can see things that need to be changed right away. But I think that many of us have been able to recognize that we've seen young guys who go into a ministry that is established, and then they go crazy trying to change a whole bunch of stuff, and immediately they get fired. I think there's the old saying that a young guy goes into a church thinking he's going to change the world, but then he gets fired for changing the bulletin. I read the story about a young guy who went and pastored a church in New England, and he noticed that at the back door of the church that there was a door that couldn't open because there was a tree that had been allowed to grow up there and had fully taken over the sidewalk, and if you opened the door, it would hit the tree. So he decided that the only obvious thing to do was to cut the tree down, and then the church fired him because apparently that tree had been planted by John Wesley. And I really don't know if that's a true story or not, but you can probably think of some people who did away with some artifacts and some legacy ministry, and then those guys are not at that church any longer. So here's something that helped me, because we've had to make a lot of sweeping changes across our ministry. The entire time I've been here for the last 7 years has been reorganizing, renovating, revamping, rewriting, all kinds of stuff that has needed to take place. And one of the guiding things that helped me, especially in the early days, was this piece of advice: social capital. So first of all, social capital carries with it the idea that you have a certain amount of capital that you can spend with each individual, each family, each group, or within the entire congregation. You'll have a certain amount of social capital when you arrive that is based upon perhaps the theology of that church, on the basis of what they think and how they respect the pastor, upon the history of that church, based on how the previous pastor behaved himself. Like, for example, if you come into a church that the pastor has not been very well respected through the committees and the board, and there's been a revolving door of pastors, then there's a low social capital for pastors within that church because they don't respect pastoral authority. There are groups within the church that are running that organization, and if you're going to last, then you're going to have to figure out the dynamics of how that works. And maybe we could argue that you probably shouldn't be pastoring a church like that to begin with. Or you might step into a church situation where the pastor was leading a double life of some kind, there was some immorality, there was misappropriation of funds, there was something that took place that caused a mistrust of the leadership, and you're coming into a more or less bankrupt situation, and people are willing to try to give you some of the benefit of the doubt, but they are watching you closely in the areas where the previous ministry failed them. Or you might be stepping into a situation where the previous pastor was trusted and he had been there for a very long time and he was well respected, and so the people are willing to love you and to give you a certain level of respect on the basis of the wonderful success that they had with the previous pastor. The dynamics of each of those situations is different, but you need to have the strategic mind to be able to recognize the level to which the people trust you and what they'll trust you with. The way that you gain social capital is by making favorable decisions in areas that the people have already given you ownership. And the way that you lose social capital is by making unfavorable decisions. Unfortunately, you're not always going to be able to make favorable decisions all the time. You're a preacher, you're not a politician, and you're not an ice cream salesperson. You are a man of God. And the people are not going to be in favor of everything that you recommend that they do or you know needs to be done. If you continue writing checks in areas where you do not have enough social capital with individuals or people or groups within the church, then eventually you're going to find yourself socially bankrupt, and the people will make a change, and that change will be you. Typically, if you spend enough social capital with an individual or a family, then they will exit the church. If you spend enough social capital with a group, then they may rally together to try to influence other people. You may end up with a church split. Or if you spend enough social capital with the entire group, then they will get rid of you. This all may be well and good, and there may be some places where, hey, it's worth it to make that decision because there needs to be some pruning that takes place in the ministry, or that you need to do some necessary things and you need to be able to move on. Maybe that needs to be the case, but choose wisely. If, as in most cases, however, you decide that God led you there because he wants you to have the tenure of a long ministry and all of that, then one of the things that can help you to be able to navigate those things is that in most cases, if there is something which is of a minor consequence that needs to be changed, but you know that it's going to have an impact, you need to be able to know the difference between what you own, what you must buy, and how much it is likely to cost. So what that means is this. When I got here to the church that I currently pastor, I realized that I was given a certain amount of social capital at the beginning. I wasn't sure how much that was, how much they were willing to love and trust me, but they had a previous pastor who had been here for 9 years and then died of cancer, so they were more or less heartbroken over that, but they had a favorable opinion of the love and the care that he provided for them. And then there was some decline in the ministry over the years, and that was something that kind of colored their thoughts about the pastorate and the incoming pastor and some of the goals that they had hoped to achieve by bringing me in as the pastor. And I felt like they had already given me ownership of my office, our home, the pulpit, and care ministry within the church. And that those were things that they expected me to do and that they expected me to do well. So with an untethered pulpit, I made a plan to preach the best messages that I could preach and made sure that I made that a top priority because I felt like that was the key area of ministry that was important for me to fulfill. And then we also did our best to start working on the grounds of the parsonage and start working on our home and make sure that it was fixed up in a way that would encourage and make the people proud of their new pastor and of the parsonage, for lack of a better term. And I got started painting my office. I asked permission about this first because they had done certain things to prepare that office space for the previous pastor. And as long as I felt like that they were comfortable with that, then we started painting that. Because I felt like that if we could start getting some new paint on the walls and get that fixed up within the building and then make it visible so people could see a change and see that it was positive, it would get them used to seeing some changes take place. But these were areas where I felt like I was already given ownership. There were some other areas that I already knew were eyesores, were poorly operating, were not really accomplishing all that they could accomplish. So I wrote those down on my list according to who I perceived owned them and how much I thought it would cost to purchase those through social capital. And that was what allowed me to strategize to make incremental changes all across the property. And anytime I came up against something that was kind of an area of resistance that I felt like just was not a hill that was worth dying on at that moment, then I didn't give up on it, but I intentionally remained patient and put that thing on the back burner. Tom Rainer calls that, in church revitalization, tactical patience. It's not the idea that that particular area is okay, but that you're just going to need a little bit more time to be able to address that, and you're going to have to earn a little bit more trust with the people. So for us, what that looked like was that the church constitution hadn't been touched since 1993, and there were many legal organizations that recommended some serious updates to our church constitution for legal protection. I had the idea initially that we should just scrap the old constitution and just implement a whole brand new one and adopt it by a 2/3 majority vote on a particular Sunday. As I started putting some of the articles together and working on some of those things, I got resistance from a few of the men in the church, even though when I came as the pastor, they told me that they knew that the church constitution needed some changes. But what I came to realize was that the reason for this was because many of them had been on the original committees and boards that formed the existing church constitution, and for them, they had put a lot of work into developing those policies, and they felt that they didn't want to see all of their work get thrown away. So when the time was appropriate and I felt that I had gained enough trust with the people, then we put together a plan for just adding the necessary recommendations to the church constitution. And what we did in our case was that we sent the church constitution off to a legal organization that we trust, that represents churches and Christians and has the ability to recommend certain amendments to your church constitution for legal protections. They came back with somewhere between 9 and 11 recommendations, and we added those recommendations and tracked all of those on a spreadsheet so that people could see how that they corresponded to certain areas of the Constitution. They could see how things were originally written and the recommendations we were making for upgrading the wording. And then I placed that in the lobby for a couple of months for revisions and review, and there were people who came back and said, I think we should change this word, or we should do this, or whatever, and we tried to take all of those into consideration. We didn't necessarily take every one of them into consideration, but once we did, we placed it before our congregation, and we had a list 1 through 11 on a ballot, and we allowed people to check off the ones that they agreed with and disagreed with. But actually, we had unanimous votes on every single article that we recommended at that time. And something that probably could have torn the church apart actually ended up being a rallying point for the church and gained additional trust because of the way that it was handled. We've done similar things with building projects. We made a list of all the things that needed to be done around the property, and with new eyes, I was able to see those things that needed to be done, but I didn't necessarily know how much each of those things would cost. And so when we put the list together, the list was non-threatening. We put it before the congregation and allowed them to rank the things that they thought needed to be done, and that helped us to put our strategy and efforts at the things that were the highest priorities for the people who were already in the church. It didn't mean that we weren't going to do everything on the list, although there may have been some things that eventually fell off because I thought I knew what needed to be done at the beginning, but actually these people had already been here for a really long time, and they had a sense of what really needed to be done. So it allowed for me to draw from their experience and wisdom, and it also gained another level of trust. In those early days, it took a lot more strategic work in order to make those things happen, but over time the cooperation came, and now people don't freak out as much when we need to paint something, or we need to renovate something, or if we need to tear something out, or we need to do something differently. Our people have gotten used to necessary changes, and it's come with cooperating and working together and building that trust, and now that's just a natural flow of the way that we do ministry here.